Maya and I got married 6 years ago. In these kinds of stories, it's common for people to talk about how amazing their wives are, and I totally get that. After all this time, I can honestly say that my wife, Maya, was not only beautiful but truly exceptional in every way. It's hard to explain exactly, but I was definitely drawn to her. Our history goes way back, all the way to when we were teenagers. What's interesting is that I'm a few years older than her. To me, she was always just the young girl who lived down the street. But something changed when she was 14, and that moment seemed to spark a deeper connection between us. Right before I was about to head off to college, I decided to leave my friends after a night at the pub. It wasn't too late, but the evening was starting to settle into dusk, so I took a shortcut through the local park. Little did I know that decision would turn out to be a lucky one. I ended up running into Maya, who was having some trouble with a couple of boys her age. Trouble might be an understatement. It was much more serious than that. If I hadn't come across her at just that moment, who knows what could have happened. According to Maya, I was her hero, swooping in and saving her. But honestly, when I stepped up to confront the two guys, they just got scared and ran off. From that point on, I became someone significant to her. Throughout the rest of the summer, I couldn't help but notice that she was always around. Not exactly following me, but making sure she was wherever I happened to be. Of course, my friends gave me a hard time, seeing as I was 18 and they thought I was too old for her. But even then, I couldn't deny that she was an incredibly attractive young woman, with long, shapely legs that were hard to ignore, even at that age. After that, I left for a 3-year period of study, and we didn't cross paths much until I came back after graduating. I spent an extended summer there before starting my new job. By that point, she was 18 and I was almost 22. Things were definitely different now. She had grown into a stunning young woman, and I could understand why her feelings for me hadn't faded. We started dating, walking hand in hand through the park, and sneaking kisses whenever we could. By that time, I wasn't a virgin anymore, but she still was. There were a few close calls, but she kept her purity intact. I'm not saying I didn't explore her body a bit, but that was as far as it went. I wasn't worried about it, though, because deep down, I still saw myself as her protector. Maya often reminded me of the time I saved her, and I'm sure that summer only made her love for me grow stronger. Honestly, I was falling for her even more, though at that point it wasn't entirely mutual. Despite discussing the possibility of other paths, we ultimately parted ways. Maya went off to Leeds Metropolitan University, and I moved to Bristol for my first job. The distance between us was a real issue. While she promised to stay faithful, I didn't take it too seriously, having seen firsthand how things could change and temptations could arise during my own time at university. I did visit her a few times, but on my last trip, it became clear she was living a separate life, and we began to drift apart. That could have been the end of our story. I didn't hold on to it, diving into a few years of exploring the Bristol scene and meeting new people. But then my path shifted, bringing me closer to home. That's when Maya reappeared in my life. By then, she had graduated and started working. When her parents invited me over, I'll admit that her initial greeting was a bit cooler than I expected. But it didn't take long for that to change. She had grown up, become more mature, sophisticated, and wise. She had lost her innocence, but not to me. Honestly, it didn't bother me, and who was I to complain? Then one evening, she confided to someone that I was still her special hero, and it felt like we were picking up where we left off. We rekindled our connection, and this time, things didn't stop at just that. Before long, we were intimate, and as we shared more of ourselves, our love only deepened. Naturally, marriage followed, as inevitable as the sunrise. 6 years later, we're still just as in love as ever. Maya can be a little conservative at times, and she disapproves of certain things, but she never pushes her views too strongly, so it's never really an issue. We're genuinely happy, and the future looks bright. The trouble started when my company offered me a promotion. A great opportunity, but with one catch. It meant moving to the lively city of Leeds, where my wife, Maya, had spent her university years. The choice was between Leeds and the Middle East, and since we were planning to start a family, Leeds felt like the more sensible option. At first, everything seemed fine. at least for the first couple of weeks as we settled into a temporary rented flat. I knew I would miss watching Arsenal play, and Leeds City wasn't about to take their place in my heart. After all, Billy Bremner and the old team were long gone, but Leeds didn't seem like a terrible place to live. For anyone who doesn't know, it's a vibrant city with a buzzing nightlife. One evening, Maya suggested we explore the city and visit some of the places she used to go to when she was a student. We popped into a few student pubs for drinks, but even Maya seemed a little out of place. After 8 years since her graduation from Leeds Met, we went to a restaurant where she had worked, but it was clear she didn't recognize anyone, and the decor had changed completely. It was obvious she felt a bit disappointed by the evening. There was something missing, something that had failed to live up to her expectations. It's strange how a place can change so much since your last visit, and the transformation can leave you feeling let down. The evening seemed to be heading in a bad direction. Finally, Maya suggested we check out a little pub on the outskirts of town where she had worked during her final year. It wasn't a student pub, so maybe there'd still be some locals around. It was still early evening as we strolled hand in hand through the city center, looking like two lovers enjoying each other's company. We left the car behind and followed Maya down a couple of narrow back alleys, where the buildings shifted from bright city lights to rundown houses and decaying workshops. I started to feel uncertain and asked Maya if it had looked like this when she was here. She laughed and reassured me that nothing had changed. She had lived nearby in a cheap flat with 3 other girls, one of whom had worked at the same pub for a while. She pointed around a corner and, with a glimmer in her eye, said she was filled with joy. That made me grin. Standing in front of us was a rundown pub I wouldn't have stepped foot in on my own. But with Maya, it felt different. Not that she ever dressed provocatively, that wasn't her style. Maya had always been the picture of elegance, from her neatly styled dark hair to her smart suits and formal high heels. That evening, however, was an exception. She wore a slightly daring short skirt. I teased her, wondering if she was trying to relive her student days, but then thought maybe she had some inkling of how the night would unfold. But then again, maybe not. No, I thought if she had known, she wouldn't have left our flat at all. The pub was called the Havens and Retreat, with 2 large, old-fashioned multicolored windows at the front that had once been quite impressive. I hesitated, unsure, and asked her if she was sure this was the place. She reassured me that it wasn't so bad once we stepped inside. With that, she flashed me a beautiful smile, the one I had cherished since I first knew her as a young girl, and pushed open the door. Little did I know, that smile would never feel the same to me again. I followed her inside, and as she promised, the interior was old-fashioned but surprisingly tidy. There was a long dark wooden bar and a charming old mirror hanging behind it. The windows, which looked so dirty from the outside, seemed perfectly fine once we were inside, with street lamp lights streaming through and casting a warm glow on the bar. Maya stood there, clearly enchanted, with recognition lighting up her face. She remarked that nothing had changed at all. I added that I doubted much would change in 50 years, which made her giggle as she looked up at me fondly. She pointed to something at the far end of the bar, letting go of my hand and sliding across the wooden floor. She called out to the bartender, "Hi there, remember me?" The bartender turned around, took one look at her, and studied her carefully. A wide smile broke across his face as he recognized her and exclaimed, "Maya, is that really you?" "Maya." Maya nodded, grinning up at him, and I realized she had finally found someone who remembered her. The evening wasn't going to be a total loss after all. He was overjoyed and rushed out from behind the bar to give her a tight hug, planting a full kiss on her lips. The embrace and kiss didn't last long enough for me to feel outright jealous, but it was enough to send an uneasy chill through my stomach, and it quickly wiped the grin from my face. They began chatting animatedly about things I didn't understand, and I stood there, waiting for some kind of introduction as they talked about people Maya had known back then. But when another man walked into the pub, I was still waiting in vain. The bartender called out to him, excitedly asking him to see who had just arrived. The man walked right past me, and the moment he spotted Maya, he called out, "Maya!" Once again, I had to watch as my wife was embraced and kissed by a man I didn't recognize. And once again, I stood there, ignored, waiting for an introduction. The second man mentioned that Lucas would be arriving soon, and to my surprise, Maya blushed. He noticed her reaction and remarked that he had a feeling that would get to her. Maya responded with, "Really? Lucas still comes around." The man assured her that Lucas would definitely be there shortly. I couldn't help but wonder who Lucas was. Maya had never mentioned him before, which I figured was reasonable, but something about the evening was starting to unsettle me. I didn't like being ignored, and I didn't like the direction things were going. I stood there on my own, feeling more like a spectator than a participant. I cleared my throat to try to get her attention, but when that didn't work, I gave a loud cough. The bartender looked at me, but Maya didn't even glance over. She was too caught up in her conversation with the other man. The bartender apologized and promised to be with me in a minute. I wasn't sure what to do. I could have grabbed her arm or said something, but she was so absorbed in reconnecting with her old friends, I decided to just hang back. I moved closer to the bar, leaning on the counter behind them. Finally, the bartender pulled himself away from my wife and asked, "Yes, mate, what can I get you?" I asked for a pint of the best and whatever the lady wanted. The bartender's smile immediately faded as I spoke. He snapped at me, seemingly oblivious to the fact that I was her husband, or that she was even with me. He said, "I don't think this young lady accepts drinks from just anyone." My temper started to flare, and I responded, "I'm pretty sure she'll have a drink with me." The bartender started to say, "Now look here, buddy, you can't come in here." But he never finished the sentence because, at that moment, Maya turned around. The raised voices had finally caught her attention, and she stepped in. She casually told the others that it was fine and I was with her, barely sparing a glance in my direction. The bartender fell silent, but he still glared at me as he poured my beer. He told me the price was £2.20 and pushed the glass toward me. I asked about the lady's drink, and he brusquely told me it was on the house. He then asked Maya what she wanted, poured it without acknowledging me, and handed it over. I stood there, sipping my pint, feeling confused and frustrated. My wife was deeply engaged in conversation with the others, laughing and sharing old memories from her time here. Lucas's name kept coming up, and every time it did, I saw a concerning smile spread across Maya's face. She continued to ignore me, and I was getting more and more upset by her behavior. I was about to step in and interrupt their conversation to get her attention when the pub door opened, and two large men walked in, one white, one West Indian. The bartender immediately called out, "Look who's here!" Lucas's turned up out of the blue. So this was Lucas, the mysterious man. He was a big guy and he looked tough. When Lucas saw Maya, his face lit up with a huge grin. He shouted, "Surprise! Maya, where have you been?" Without a word, he rushed past me, and as the others moved aside, he wrapped her in a tight hug. Maya kissed him back with equal enthusiasm, and this time, the kiss lingered a little too long for my liking. The way everyone stood there beaming at the two of them, while they remained locked together, didn't help matters. Then, to my shock, Lucas's left hand dropped to her back and cupped her bottom. That was it. I'd had enough. I stepped forward, deciding that if Maya was going to allow this and couldn't even acknowledge me in front of her friends, then it was time to leave. But just as I took a step forward, a large, strong hand landed heavily on my shoulder, stopping me dead in my tracks. A deep voice from behind me said, "Wouldn't do that if I were you, mate." As I realized the guy had anticipated my move and stepped in to stop me, I spun around, my anger flaring, and snapped, "Get your hand off me." I tried to shake him off, but he wasn't budging. The four of them turned toward me, all squarely focused, clearly ready for trouble. Maya, without even looking at me, told them to leave me be. She said I had brought her here tonight, that I was fine and wouldn't cause any problems. She spoke the words calmly, almost carelessly, as if I wasn't even standing right next to her. She glanced in my direction for a moment, but our eyes never met. The big guy, still gripping my shoulder, warned me to stay cool, his voice carrying a hint of threat. He let go of me but positioned himself between me and the group, effectively separating me from them. I couldn't believe what was happening. A cold lump of dread started to form in my stomach. Just 20 minutes earlier, I had been walking hand in hand with my beloved wife, feeling blissfully in love as we strolled through the heart of the city center. Now, here I was, sidelined, forgotten. As Maya gravitated toward one of the tables in the crowded pub, I watched as several attractive women, dressed provocatively, approached Lucas and his sidekick, engaging in brief conversations before either leaving or taking their places at the bar. I wasn't naive enough to ignore what was going on. These women were what I could only describe as workers. More specifically, they worked for Lucas. The realization hit me hard. My prim and proper wife, Maya, was socializing with a pimp. It had to be Lucas. He must have been a bloody pimp. Could she be so blind to what was happening around her? Regardless of her obliviousness, I knew one thing for sure. Maya and I needed to leave. I called out loudly enough for her to hear, saying, "It's time we left." I urged her again. "Come on, Maya. Let's go." She glanced over at me, her smile faltering, replaced by a troubled expression. She didn't say no, nor did she say anything at all. Maya simply shook her head at me, then turned back to her friends. Her smile returned, and before long, she was giggling like a schoolgirl, as though she had completely forgotten I was even there. The deep voice at my side warned me once again to play it cool or piss off, saying he wouldn't warn me again. I tried to protest, but before I could get the words out, his large hand pushed firmly against my chest, guiding me away from the group and back toward the bar. He informed me that the lady didn't seem interested in me and suggested that I stay there and wait for her, or just leave. He even had the audacity to suggest I try my luck with one of the other women. Without waiting for my response, he signaled to one of the women at the bar and introduced her to me as Sally. "She'll take care of you tonight," he said, clearly trying to brush me off. "Forget about the little lady over there. Lucas and her have a lot to catch up on. If your date didn't go as planned, well, that's life." I stood there, speechless with rage, as the courtesan, Sally, warned me not to push my luck. She advised me to let it go and suggested I find another girl for the night, saying she was attractive enough. I looked at her, incredulous, and hissed, "She's not my girlfriend. She's my wife." Realizing her mistake, Sally's expression shifted, and she seemed genuinely concerned. She acknowledged that the situation was bad, though I wasn't sure if that meant anything to her. I tried to return to the table, but Sally blocked my path, her hand raised to stop me. "Hold on, you really don't want to do that," she said, her tone serious. Frustrated, I demanded to know what I should do. Sally offered to talk to Maya for me, asking if I was really her husband. The look on my face must have answered her question, because she nodded and slowly made her way toward the table where Maya and the others were sitting. I watched as she leaned in, whispering something in Maya's ear. For the first time since entering the pub, Maya looked up and met my gaze. There was almost a look of surprise in her eyes, as if she'd genuinely forgotten I was there. She quickly looked away and whispered something back to Sally. Sally returned to me, conveying that Maya would come over to see me shortly. I snapped, my patience wearing thin. "I want her here now, not in a minute." Sally gave me a warning look. "Don't push your luck, mister," she said before turning to approach another customer further down the bar. I stood there, livid, my eyes fixed on Maya. Lucas's arm had slid around her shoulders, his fingers casually brushing against her chest. She threw a few half-hearted smiles my way, but I could feel my temper building, counting the minutes until I would finally snap. 5 minutes passed, and then Maya stood up. Instead of coming straight to me, though, she made her way toward the toilets, disappearing through the door. I wasn't sure whether to follow or just wait. Before I could decide, she reappeared, glanced briefly at Lucas's group, and walked toward me. At that point, I couldn't hold it in anymore. I angrily demanded, "What the hell are you playing at? We need to leave. Now." When I reached for her arm, she pushed me away and backed off, telling me not to cause a scene. "You can go if you want," she said coolly, "but I'm staying. I'm here to chat with my old friends." Her voice was firm, yet devoid of any real warmth, and she didn't even look at me as she spoke. I stood there, stunned, struggling to comprehend how the woman who had professed her love for me earlier that day was now telling me to leave. When I didn't respond, she added, almost matter-of-factly, "It's better if you just go home, Ethan. I'll get a taxi back later. We'll talk about this then." I cried out, my voice thick with frustration. "I'm not leaving you here." She sighed, resignation in her tone. "Stay and watch if you have to, Ethan. But trust me, you might not like what you see. Just don't interfere." I tried again, urging her to leave with me, but she resisted, repeating that it would be better if I left now. She reassured me, "I'll see you later. Don't worry, sweetheart. Everything will be fine. I love you, and I'll make it up to you. Just give me this one evening, and everything will go back to the way it was." She tried to pull away, her voice soft but insistent. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I seized her arm in disbelief, my anger boiling over. But before I knew it, I was shoved back against the bar by the big guy, his hand knocking mine away from her. I swung at him in anger, but it was futile. He shoved me further down the bar and then slammed me to the ground, his grin twisted with amusement. "I warned you," he sneered, as he effortlessly hoisted me to my feet and propelled me toward the door. Julian shouted for him to stop, urging him that I hadn't done any real harm. I'm not sure if Maya's pleas had any effect, but at least she tried. The next thing I knew, I was outside, doubled over from the gut punch he delivered, followed by a crushing blow to my chest. It felt like a train had hit me, and I collapsed onto the pavement, gasping for air, unable to move. For a long while, I lay there, stunned, trying to process what had just happened. 2 punches, just 2, and I was a wreck, hurting all over and still unable to stand. It took a good 10 minutes before I managed to push myself upright, shaking off the dirt and grime from the street. How had things escalated so quickly? What had started as a perfect evening had descended into this chaos. It was all too much. I wasn't some soft pushover, but how could I stand up to someone like him? He'd kill me. I'd never felt so humiliated, so hopeless, in my entire life. What had happened to me? I felt like nothing, like a failure, a far cry from the man I once thought I was. I didn't know anyone in Leeds. I didn't have anyone to call for help. So I stood there, watching as men went in and out of the pub, some of them leaving with women on their arms. I realized then the pub was a brothel. My wife, the woman I'd loved for 6 years, was in a brothel, and she had taken me there. She must have known what it was. I fought back tears as I struggled with what to do next. I couldn't just walk away, leave her there. I didn't know what to do with her, but I knew I couldn't abandon her. If she didn't come home with me tonight, I felt certain that everything between us was over. It must have been more than an hour before I managed to gather myself enough to go back inside. I had no idea what to expect, but nothing could have prepared me for what I walked into. It was like something out of a nightmare. My wife, Maya, was standing in the middle of a makeshift striptease act, and the last of her clothes were about to be stripped away. A group of men circled around her and the other woman, grinning and laughing. I could feel my blood boiling as I pushed through the crowd, heading straight for Maya. She looked around in alarm when I grabbed her, her face stricken with a mix of distress and panic. "Oh no, Ethan, for Christ's sake, no," she cried out, but I didn't care anymore. Before I could get her away, someone slammed into me, hitting me hard in the face. The lights went out as I crumpled to the ground. The last thing I saw before everything went black was Lucas holding Maya, and her expression, horror mixed with guilt, as she watched me being dragged out of the pub. The second round of violence was brutal, and it wasn't until several hours later that I finally came to, lying in a car park some distance from the pub. I heard all over, but nothing seemed broken. I staggered to my feet and somehow found my way back to our car. It took another hour to start it and another to drive back to our rented flat. I collapsed on the sofa, exhausted and defeated, not caring when or how Maya would return. The next morning, I woke up feeling like I'd hit rock bottom. The pain in my body was almost unbearable, but the pain in my mind felt worse. I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. Was my marriage over? I couldn't make sense of it. How could Maya, the woman I'd known so well, act like this. The woman I had been ready to start a family with had betrayed me in the worst possible way. It was 11 a.m. Where was she? I wasn't about to go after her. The phone had just been connected the day before, and unless it was a cold caller, the only person who had the number was Maya. I picked up the phone and answered. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. Couldn't hold back. "Do you even understand what happened last night?" I asked, my voice shaky with emotion. She sounded remorseful.
I'm sorry, Ethan.
I shouldn't have gone back to the pub. It was a mistake. I shouldn't have done it. I should have been with you. Where are you? I demanded to know where she was but ignored her question about my well-being. Where are you, Maya? I asked sharply. She hesitated, then urgently replied, No. Don't be stupid, Ethan. She trailed off, realizing what she was about to say. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. On the other end of the line, I could hear her sobbing quietly. She begged for my understanding, trying to explain herself. She told me how much she wanted things to go back to normal, to come home, and to fix everything. She promised she would explain everything if I just gave her a chance. Desperately, I wanted to tell her to leave, to walk away from it all. But I knew this had to be resolved, one way or the other. I told her she should make her own way home or get one of her boyfriends to drive her back. Oh, thank you, Ethan, she whimpered, her voice soft with something that sounded like relief. I'll be back in half an hour at most. Everything will be okay. You'll see. Everything will be okay. I slammed the phone down before she could say another word. Damn it, I loved her, but I hated her, too. What the hell was I supposed to say when she came back? Should I tell her to pack her bags and leave? Or would I still take her in my arms? As it turned out, I didn't need to make that decision. Half an hour passed, then an hour, then two. The afternoon turned into evening, and still no sign of my wife. By 8 p.m., it was clear she wasn't coming home. Not that night, anyway, and that possibly meant never coming home again. The hours wore on, and my anger simmered, cold and calculating, an icy fury building within me. I didn't shout or scream. I was beyond that. I packed a few things into the car and drove back to the city center, hoping I could find the pub again. After a few wrong turns, I finally recognized a large factory and, just down the road, the Havens Retreat pub parking around the corner. I stepped out of the car and walked toward the bar. On the outside, I tried to appear confident, but my heart was pounding in my chest. Inside, I was nervous, even frightened. After what had happened to me the night before, I couldn't be sure how they'd treat me this time. I hesitated outside the door, unsure what to expect. I didn't even know if Maya was still inside. With a deep breath, I pushed the door open and entered. The place looked the same as before. Rough characters, rough women, a place where nobody cared about anyone else. I recognized a few faces, and some of them seemed surprised to see me. If they hadn't known who I was from the night before, the black eye and bruises on my face would have given it away. The barman spotted me and asked, "Haven't you had enough, mate?" I demanded to know where Maya was. My frustration and anger were boiling over. The barman looked genuinely surprised but didn't hesitate to question the idea of Maya being my wife. He frowned, clearly confused, but when I nodded, he looked back at me, his expression softening with a hint of sympathy. He muttered, "She told us you were just a date." He didn't seem to expect that response, but then his face turned serious, his tone cautious. He glanced at the far corner and tilted his head. Following his gaze, I saw her. Maya was sitting on Lucas's lap, looking shocked and uncomfortable as she tried to cover herself. Lucas just grinned at me like he'd won some kind of victory. I walked over to them, my chest tightening. I asked Maya about the half hour she'd promised me, asking if something had caused a delay. She said nothing at first, her face pale with shock. Lucas, not even bothering to look at me, sneered and told me to leave, adding that he'd send her home when he decided it was time. Maya finally found her voice, whispering, "Please, Ethan, I'll definitely be back home later. I promise you." Lucas just laughed, kissing her mockingly. "You'll go when I say you can," he taunted, his eyes watching me carefully, waiting for a reaction. Ignoring Lucas, I turned to Maya. I didn't even look at him anymore. "This is your last chance," I said, my voice firm but quiet. "You have to choose now." I thought it through. If she'd picked me, if she'd shown that she was ready to leave him and come back to me, maybe, just maybe, I would have tried to work through things. We could have talked, maybe even repaired it. At that moment, I wasn't sure, but I was willing to give her a chance to make things right. But her face, the indecision in her eyes, told me everything I needed to know. Her lovely brown eyes, so full of pain, reflected the truth. She knew how much she had hurt me, but instead of coming to me, she was wondering how much more she could get away with. How much farther could she push me before I'd break, before I'd give up? Maya finally whispered, urging me to be reasonable, to understand. In that moment, I realized it was over. She had failed me, again. This wasn't just a mistake. It was the end. She pleaded with me, wanting one last chance to relive her student days, to see her old friends again. She asked me to wait just a little longer while she had her last fling, promising everything would go back to normal. "I love you, Ethan," she assured me, her eyes pleading. "I'll make it up to you. Please, just wait for me." But I said nothing in response. Maya started to say something else, but Lucas had clearly had enough. He kissed her hard, then shoved her out with even more force. Her words dissolved into nothingness. That was it. I had all the information I needed. My wife was coming back, but I'd have to wait until tomorrow, or the day after, or maybe even longer. Fine. That was great, wasn't it? I noticed the West Indian guy edging closer to me, so I held up my hands and backed off. There was no point in getting involved in another one-sided fight. The bar had gone silent, everyone waiting to see what would happen next. But as far as I was concerned, nothing was going to happen. Not immediately, at least. "See you all later then," I said quietly, turning to leave. "I'm not still 14, Ethan," Maya suddenly burst out. "I can look after myself now." Her words hit me hard. Her one special thing, the thing she'd always held over me, and now she was throwing it back in my face. "I'm sorry, Ethan," she said quickly, her face falling as she saw how much it hurt me. "I didn't mean that. But I ignored her, stepping backward toward the door, not bothering with her incoherent apology. Lucas laughed loudly and, without hesitation, ripped her blouse off. He even reached up under her skirt as he taunted me, rubbing my misery in my face. It might have been that which caused the tears to roll down her cheeks, though I doubted it. Perhaps, in some twisted way, she still loved me. Seeing me humiliated like that, maybe it was just too much for her. At least, that's what I like to think. As I closed the door behind me, the silence in the pub shattered as everyone started talking and laughing at once. They probably thought they had seen the last of me. I walked slowly back to my car, opened the boot, and took out the things I'd packed earlier. Anyone watching me would have thought I was cool, relaxed even. But inside, I was fuming, terrified of what I was about to do. I didn't know how it was going to turn out, but I was going to do it anyway. I had a license for my over and under Browning 12-bore shotgun. I'd been going clay pigeon shooting for a couple of years, and while I wasn't great at it, I figured I didn't need to be for what I had planned. I pulled out a handful of cartridges, making sure they were small caliber. I didn't want to end up in prison on a homicide charge. I broke the weapon open and loaded 2 rounds into it, stuffing the rest into my jacket pocket. Minutes later, I was back outside the pub, staring at the 2 large engraved windows. This will wake them up, I thought, my heart thundering in my chest. This wasn't me. It just wasn't. But what else could I do? I couldn't go back in and argue with her. She wouldn't agree. I'd probably get another beating. I certainly wasn't going to go home and wait for her to come back, expecting to have some civil discussion about how she'd humiliated me. No bloody way. It had gone beyond that, and I wasn't going to take any more from any of them. I took aim at the first window, trying to steady my trembling arm. The barrel swayed as I fought to control my nerves. But it didn't matter, no more than 12 feet from the window. I squeezed the trigger, resisting the urge to close my eyes, and the loud bang shattered the silence. The window exploded into a swirl of broken glass. I shifted my aim, fired the second round, and the second window shattered just as easily. The echo of the shots reverberated around the nearby buildings, far louder than when I'd practiced in the open fields. I calmly reloaded the shotgun, then waited to see what would happen. I had no idea how they would react, but I was ready. Ready to show them that they had made a big mistake if they thought I was just some pushover. The doors of the pub flew open, and several guys rushed out. They stopped dead when they saw me standing there, the shotgun in hand. No one moved. Then Lucas came charging out with his big henchman, Julian, behind him. "Stupid effing stinker!" Lucas screamed, charging toward me, maybe thinking I hadn't reloaded. Maybe he wasn't thinking at all. I took careful aim at his knees, not wanting to kill him, just to stop him. My arm was steady now, as calm as I'd ever been. I could see the panic on his face before he even knew what was happening. I squeezed the trigger. The shot hit him low, and he went down, screaming in pain. The second shot found its mark in Julian, and the two of them were left writhing on the ground. The pub went quiet, except for the groans and screams. I didn't even bother to reload. My emotions were shot. Fortunately, the rest of the crowd started to scatter and the scene grew calm. Relatively speaking, at least, with two injured men still making a lot of noise. The walk back to the car felt short, but my legs were so shaky that I thought I might collapse any second. I carefully placed the rifle back in the boot, started the engine, and made my way home, driving slowly and cautiously. I considered going back into the pub to scare the hell out of Maya, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. I didn't trust myself. To be honest, what I'd just done terrified me, but I had done it, just like I promised I would. But enough was enough. Strangely, I slept soundly that night. When I woke up, I felt surprisingly refreshed. My black eye and bruises were still there, but I felt better than I had in days. I wondered which would show up first, Maya or the police. I hadn't even bothered to put the rifle away. It was still in the boot. Around 10 a.m., I got a phone call. "Are you the husband of Maya Davidson?" "Yes," I replied, unsure what this was about. It was the police. I had expected them to come for me, maybe to arrest me, but the call was about Maya. They told me she had been arrested and was at the station, asking me to come and pick her up. My surprise must have shown, so I asked why she had been arrested. The response was unsettling. She'd been taken in for prostitution, along with several other women, after a shooting on the edge of town. I understood immediately. The pieces of her strange behavior, the late nights, the lies. Everything clicked into place. The officer acknowledged my understanding, though his tone mired regret. He explained that such situations weren't uncommon, but my realization seemed to have contributed to Maya's downfall. They had initially assumed she was more upper class than the others, and my refusal to pick her up likely worsened her situation. She was eventually prosecuted, found guilty, and lost her new job. It became difficult for her to secure future employment, given the stigma of a prostitution conviction, especially for a young female graduate. Oddly, the police never asked about my rifle. It was registered to me back in Ashford, where we had just moved from, but they didn't check it. I wasn't a suspect, so why would they? But I wondered why no one at the pub had turned me in. I had no answers. Maya tried contacting me repeatedly after that. I didn't meet up with her, but eventually, I picked up one of her calls. She sounded desperate, telling me she still loved me, spouting all the usual nonsense. I think she meant it too, and it seemed like she was heartbroken that I wouldn't take her back. I refused to discuss it. She sounded a little scared of me after what I'd done, and I wasn't about to entertain the idea of taking her back. When I asked her about her past involvement with Lucas and her job at the pub during her student days, she was brutally honest. I demanded an explanation. How had she gone from working behind the bar to what had happened the other night? Maya explained that she had never mentioned working behind the bar during her student years. That one line hit me like a punch to the gut. It was then I realized she had worked for Lucas as one of his girls. That explained the hold he had over her. I had unknowingly married a woman with a hidden past, a past I only uncovered when I returned to that pub. Whether that revelation was a blessing or a curse, I'll leave to others to decide. But it was Maya who warned me that Lucas would come looking for me once he'd recovered. Maybe that's why no one from the pub had said anything to the police. People like him, people in that world, tend to handle their own problems. He'd never find me, though. I backed out of the job in Leeds once the news of my wife's arrest became public, but I took the position in the Middle East instead, where they were happy to have me as a bachelor. It was cheaper than hiring a married couple, after all. And that brings us back to where we started. I got away with it. To my surprise, I actually got away with it, and they chalked the whole thing up to a gangland shooting. As for me, well, that's a natural question. I gave up clay pigeon shooting and sold my rifle. I took up golf instead and got pretty good at it. Eventually, I brought my handicap down to 6. I dated quite a few women, but none of them measured up to Maya. Funny thing is, it took me a while to realize just how good she had been in bed. Well, she would have been, wouldn't she? She'd had plenty of practice in more ways than one. Then I met Sophie, a lovely American woman I'd met in Dubai. Life was fine after that, really fine. I never asked too many questions about where she'd gotten her experience, but I always thought she was just a gifted amateur. I hope so, anyway. We never married. She didn't want to, and strictly speaking, I was still married and still hadn't bothered to get divorced. I came back to the UK from time to time, but I always avoided Leeds, until one day I couldn't resist. One Thursday in June, I found myself slowly driving past the Havens and Retreat, hoping nobody would recognize me. After all this time, the once stylish windows had been replaced with modern double-glazed units. Pity, really. I'd liked the old ones. I sat there in my car for a while, and then, to my surprise, a guy in a wheelchair showed up. He was a big guy, tough-looking, but much fatter than I remembered, Lucas. Of course, I'd only seen him a few times, and that was 4 or 5 years ago. What confirmed it was the big man pushing him, the one with the terrible limp that could only have been Julian. Then a group of women poured out of the pub to check on Lucas, probably making it easier for him to report to them than struggle up the 3 steep steps into the bar. They all looked rough, just like I remembered, except for one. One of them stood out. Pretty, slender, beautiful, with long legs. Could have been her, but she looked much, much older. She still had her hair short, and she was still well-dressed. But her eyes had that worn-out look, and the smile I once loved wasn't there. She didn't look happy at all. But I didn't stick around to find out. She'd once said, "Not 14 anymore, and I can look after myself." Funny how things turn out, isn't it? If that damn restaurant hadn't redecorated their dining room, maybe she would be at home now with our children, the ones we'll never have. I wouldn't have known any better, and maybe we could have lived happily ever after.